What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Ravi Wadden, and in today's video, I want to talk about whether or not you should buy or lease the new Tesla Model 3 Performance. So with Tesla leases, there's a couple of things that you need to consider before you decide whether you want to finance or lease the car. The first thing you want to consider is how long you're going to keep the car. If you're going to keep the car for 3 to 4 years, then you're probably better off leasing the car. If you're going to keep it for 7, 8, 9, 10 years or longer, then you're probably better off financing it. And the reason that's important is because Tesla leases don't have a buyout option. You have to turn the lease back in at the end of the lease term. So determining how long you're going to keep the car is essential in determining whether or not you're going to finance or lease this car. The second thing you want to consider, and this is sort of hedging your bet, is whether or not Tesla will be lowering the price on this Model 3 Performance. Because if you think that Tesla will be lowering the price on this Model 3 Performance, if history is any indicator, then you're better off leasing this Tesla Model 3. But don't worry, I'll touch on Tesla price drops later in this video, and I'll talk about how that impacts whether or not you should lease or buy this particular car. So in the first part of the video, what we'll do is we'll do a full lease analysis by going to Tesla.com. We'll talk about the details of the lease, like the mileage, the monthly payment, etc. And then in the second part of this video, we'll talk about my 1.25% rule of leasing, which is pretty much a rule of thumb that I use to determine whether or not a lease is a good value or not. And then in the third part of this video, we'll talk about Tesla leases not having a buyout option and how that can impact your financial decision between financing or leasing this car. In the fourth part of this video, we'll briefly look at finance monthly payments versus lease monthly payments for this Model 3 Performance. And then in the fifth part of this video, we'll talk about Tesla price drops and how that can impact your decision of whether or not you should lease or finance this particular Model 3 Performance. So if that sounds good to you, please be sure to like this video. And with that, let's jump into the computer. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on Tesla.com. Let's go ahead and hover over Vehicles, Model 3, and click on Order. And now you will see that you have 3 different options. You have the Model 3 rear-wheel drive, the long-range all-wheel drive, and the Performance all-wheel drive, which we will cover in this video. And as you can see, you can lease this car for $549 a month. And if you wanted to buy it outright cash, the MSRP is $52,990, but we're going to lease this particular car, and Tesla's kind of changed the format or the layout of their page. So what you want to do now is click on this little icon where it says $2,999 down, 36 months, 10,000 miles. Now, as you can see, there is a total down payment of $2,999. The lease term is 36 months, and you can do a 24-month lease as well if you would like to. And the annual miles that it defaults to is 10,000 miles a year. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want a 12 or a 15,000 mile a year lease with this Tesla, you should get it up front, especially with this car not having a buyout option. It's really important to get the mileage that you want up front rather than having to pay the excess mileage penalty. And if I scroll down, you can see that the excess mileage penalty is 25 cents per mile. Now, as you can see, the estimated lease payment for this car is $549 a month, and that includes the destination fee of $1,390. And if we look at the fine print, it does say that you forego the option to buy your car at the end of the lease and must return it to Tesla after the lease term. And lease vehicles are subject to a $395 disposition fee on return. Now, in this part of this video, let's actually run the 1.25% rule of leasing. Now, the 1.25% rule of leasing is just a rule of thumb that I use to determine whether or not a lease is a good value or not. So let's go ahead and run this rule on this Tesla. And I do factor for taxes when I run this 1.25% rule of leasing, so I'm going to unclick the include estimated taxes and fees. Now I'm going to take the $2,999 down payment and I'm going to divide it by 36 since this is a 36-month lease. And when I do that, I'm breaking up that down payment into 36 equal payments, and that's $83.30. Now what I'm going to do is add the monthly payment of $549 to this amount. And when I do that, I get a pre-tax monthly payment with nothing down of $632 a month. And now I'm going to multiply this by 1.1 to account for 10% sales tax here in Seattle, where I live. And when I do that, I get a zero down lease payment of $695 a month on a 2024 Tesla Model 3 Performance. And when I divide this by this vehicle's MSRP, which is $52,990, and then multiply by 100 to move the decimal point over 2 spots, I get 1.31%. Now with my 1.25% rule of leasing, anytime your monthly payment with zero down, not zero due at signing, but zero down is less than 1.5% of the MSRP, that's a good lease deal. If your monthly payment is less than 1.25% of the MSRP, that's a great lease deal. And if your monthly payment with zero down and taxes included is less than 1% of the MSRP, that's an amazing lease deal. And this Tesla Model 3 Performance sitting at 1.31% is a good lease deal, and it's on the cusp of a great lease deal. And now let's actually compare the lease payment on this Tesla Model 3 to the payments if you were to finance this car with the same money down. So with the lease payment, you're at $549 a month with a down payment of $2,999. And if we were to finance this car with the same $2,999 down, doing a 72-month term, assuming you have excellent credit, and an estimated APR of 6.39%, and not including taxes and fees, you have an estimated payment of $863. And ladies and gentlemen, that's why I run the 1.25% rule of leasing. It really gives you an estimate of whether or not a car is a good lease deal, a great lease deal, or an amazing lease deal. And that's why I say this is a good lease deal, because when you compare the monthly payments, you're at $863 versus $549 if you lease this car. And $863 minus $549 is a monthly savings of roughly $314 a month. And when you multiply this by 36 months, if you leased it, you're saving $11,304 over the course of this lease if you were to lease it instead of finance it. And if you ask me, $11,304 is a substantial amount. Now in this section of the video, I want to talk about why the Tesla Model 3 Performance is sort of a long-term rental, because it has no buyout option at the end of the lease term. You see, traditionally with most leases and most manufacturers, at the end of the lease, you have the option to buy the car for the residual value, and the residual value is usually set by the manufacturer, and that's the amount that they think that the car will be worth at the end of the lease term. And manufacturers can get residual values wrong all the time. Sometimes your car at the end of the lease term is worth more than the residual value, meaning you have positive equity that you can realize at the end of the lease term. And sometimes it's worth less than the residual value, and that just means, hey, you just turn the car back in and you don't have to deal with negative equity. Now with Tesla, you don't have the option to buy the car whether you want to realize positive equity, or sometimes you lease a car and you just love it and you want to keep it long term. But with Tesla, that's just not possible. And ladies and gentlemen, that's definitely something you want to factor into your decision of leasing or buying a Tesla Model 3 Performance. But if you ask me, leasing a Tesla still makes more sense unless you're going to keep your Tesla for more than 10 years, and that's due to price drops, and that's what we're going to talk about in this section. Now, one thing that's really unique about Tesla is that while other manufacturers are constantly raising the price of certain models and trims, Tesla is on this hell-bent journey to try to figure out how to reduce the price of their cars year after year after year. As a matter of fact, they just reduced the price of a bunch of models by $3,000 just a couple of days ago. And historically speaking, when you look at the last 3 to 4 years, if you look at Tesla price changes, I mean, some of these models have dropped by $30,000 or $40,000. Like if we look at the Model 3 or the Model Y, which are the highest selling models, you've had price drops of about $30,000 from their peak, I think in 2021 or 2022. And ladies and gentlemen, the people who financed their Tesla Model Ys at the peak of pricing, I mean, they just did not do well financially. They're sitting in a world of financial trouble because they have a ton of negative equity. And those same people would have been much better off financially had they just leased those cars 2, 3, 4 years ago. Now, my logic as to why I think leasing a Tesla still makes sense has to do with price cuts. I mean, they may not be as dramatic as they were, but in my opinion, and if I was a betting man, I can assure you that Tesla is going to drop the prices on this Model 3 Performance eventually. It may not be in 3 months, but it might be in 6 months or 9 months or a year. And if you were to finance this car or buy it outright, you're going to be in a world of pain because you not only have to deal with the natural depreciation that occurs when you buy or finance a new car, but then you have price drops that work against you as well. And with leasing a car, you know what your depreciation risk is going to be, especially when you're looking at a 1.31% lease deal. Now, if this Tesla Model 3 was leasing at like 1.6, 1.7%, I would say, hey, don't even lease this car, don't even think about it. But the fact of the matter is that this is a good value in terms of leasing. So for me, I would lease this car. I would just keep it for 3 years, lease it, be done with it. I wouldn't finance it unless I was keeping it for the long haul. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wrap up the video. Please let me know in the comments whether you would lease or finance a Tesla Model 3 Performance. Financial knowledge is power. Please like and follow for more.